This episode is brought to you by the Command Presence Leadership Institute. Find out more by visiting commandpresence.net.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership with Michael Warren. Be the leader you wish that you had.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership podcast, where we believe that leadership is about two things. We believe that it is about people and it is about actions. We talk with leaders from across society who are stepping up to do what they can, where they are, with what they have. The question, though, is what can we learn from them? What can we learn from each other as we strive to be the leader that we wish we had? Folks, today is episode number 11. Episode 11 is going to be a little bit different because today you are stuck with just me. There is no guest. We've got 10 episodes into the book, or into the can, as they say in the industry, and we wanted to take time to reflect on where we've been, but we also want to talk about what we've learned, and we also want to talk about where do we go from here. But before I get into specifics, I just wanted to say that I have been blown away by our guests so far. And folks, I'm going to be very transparent with you, and I'll tell you that I wasn't sold on the concept behind this podcast. Now, don't get me wrong. I am sold, completely sold on the importance of effective leadership. But what I wasn't sure about was how this podcast was going to come across. I didn't know how you were going to take it. I didn't know if you were going to get from it what I hoped that you would get from it. And the reason is, folks, because of the various backgrounds of the guests. For those of you who don't know, I hosted another podcast previously. That one, to be very honest with you, I thought was very, very good. But it was focused on the first responder realm. And I love the first responder realm. Folks, I'm a retired police officer. If you listened, you know that. That podcast, in many ways, was easy to do. The conversation flowed, as the saying goes. The time that we set aside for each episode, it went by very quickly. And that was what I was concerned that the Faces of Leadership might be lacking, is that quality of kinship, of shared experiences, of camaraderie. And I am here to tell you, folks, I was wrong. I was dead wrong. Because while our experiences, the guests' experiences and my experiences have looked different, the basis of them were remarkably similar. And I guess that I shouldn't have been surprised. And the reason why I shouldn't have been surprised, because I should have recognized that when the peculiarities, the anomalous part of the different parts of the jobs that we do, when you strip all that stuff away, what is left are people. And what's left is human beings that are impacted in a positive manner for the most part, because there have been some negative ones, if you remember correctly. But at its core, leadership is the same no matter what the industry. No matter who it is that's involved in this relationship, they're the same because it is a combination of people working together, two or more people working together towards a common goal. And that, folks, at its core is what leadership is all about. So I wanted to take a moment, if I could, to thank the guests that we've had on for leading me to that realization. And folks, it's something that I probably cognitively knew. It's something that logically I understood, but we don't always operate in the world of logic. My guests, they showed me that I was wrong. And I don't like being wrong, so I'm going to try to be better from here on out. The journey that our guests have taken, I hope they've taken you on, but I know that they've taken me on, has been nothing short of eye-opening and insightful. So I wanted to publicly thank them for what their role is in that journey. But I do want to take a second, if I could, and just do a quick review of the first 10 episodes, because at the end, I try to share some of my takeaways. But one of the beautiful things is looking back and saying, man, that was really, really good. Not the stuff that I did, the stuff that they did. Let's be clear about that. But if you would indulge me, I just want to do a review, if we could, of where we've been and the things I've learned, the things that I hope you've learned, and where do we go from here? What does the journey that begins at episode 12, what does that look like? What do we hope to accomplish? So let's go back, if we could, to the very first episode. And folks, episode 1 was one of those episodes where I was both excited and scared to death. And I was excited because we're starting this new venture, but I was scared to death because I didn't know. I was hoping, but I didn't know for sure how our guest and I would interact, because he's not from the same industry that I am. But our guest, if you remember correctly, is David Salters, and he's a labor market expert. You know, one of the things that we hear talked about often nowadays is the shortage of workers in the job market. And that's true. There is. But David, whose expertise in that area, he took us further into the root causes of the job market shortage. Listen, the truth is all of us are shorthanded. It's very rare that you go to any place of business and find that there's not a help wanted sign somewhere around there. He took us a little bit deeper. And folks, bottom line is the reasons behind us being shorthanded probably are not impacted by the efforts that organizations, that agencies are currently doing to counteract them. Bottom line, if we use data and we take a deep dive, we can understand what the root problem is. And that is what is needed if we really want to address an issue. And this episode happened to focus on the job market. That's true of anything that a leader is facing. Folks, we cannot always rely on our intuition. We have to look at what the data is telling us, and we have to put that data into the proper context. And then we have to get experts in the field, hopefully, that can give us a deeper understanding so that we can be acting more appropriately to address the problem. So big shout out to David Salters for sharing that with us. Episode 2 happened to have a guest named Matt Sloan. And I met Matt through a friend of mine, but he's an entrepreneur and a business owner. And folks, as a guy who worked in law enforcement, I would just want to tell you that I would rather go and deal with people who are armed than think about being an entrepreneur. That type of uncertainty scares me to death. And it was interesting listening to his story, because this is a guy who already had a successful career, but he decided that he needed something more. And if you go back and listen to the episode, you'll find out that not only was there a big job change going on in his life at the time, but if you go back and listen, there were a lot of things going on in his personal life that made this jump even scarier. So he took a step, though. He stepped out, a giant step, if you will, and he started his own company. In his new endeavor, Matt, he was, and to be frank with you, he still is doing meaningful work. And let's be honest with each other, folks. Not everybody in society can say that they're doing meaningful work, but Matt can. I want you to understand that just because you're doing something meaningful, that does not necessarily translate to work without stress. Because you can be doing something meaningful and there still be stress involved. And perhaps the biggest stress was his understanding that he was responsible for the leadership of, and this one right here is the one that would get me, the financial well-being of others in his company. That is a heavy burden, heavy burden. But he found ways that he could mitigate and manage these stressors. I think it's important again, to point out, because I did there in the episode, I appreciate people who see a problem, but they aren't satisfied with just being a problem identifier. They want to be problem solvers. And Matt shares his experiences with others through his podcast. But I do think it's a good time to remind me that just like courage, that courage is just like leadership, that it has many different faces, that courage takes on different beings, if you will, because it takes a tremendous amount of courage, folks, to step away from something that is relatively sure and step into the unknown. But Matt did that, and I want to thank Matt for sharing his journey with us. The episode number 3 was an interesting one too, and I'm going to say interesting and fun and all that stuff all the way through this, just so you know. But our guest on episode number 3 was David Snively, And he currently is a program director for the largest law enforcement executive organization in the world. It truly is an organization of bosses. One of the most profound things that I think that he shared with us during that episode was that effective leaders must, not should, must get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because the truth of the matter is, folks, doing meaningful work does not always mean that it's fun. Just like we talked about in episode 2, it doesn't mean that it's without stress. Doing meaningful work doesn't mean that you're always going to be having fun. In fact, if we understand it, doing what is needed often requires us to do things that we quite simply do not enjoy. But here's the big thing here, folks. Leaders recognize that the right thing is always right. If we have been intentional in our work as a leader of intentionally building legitimacy, both internal to the organization and external to the organization, those who are aligned with the mission will recognize the authenticity of our work. They will give us the benefit of the doubt. They may recognize that they may not agree with the decision, and there are going to be cases where there will be negative impact by the decision. But if we're intentional in our work up until then, we're more likely to get the benefit of the doubt. But it all comes back to you got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and doing the right thing is always the right thing. So big thanks to our guest that episode, David Snively. Fantastic guy, really smart guy. I hope that we can do some additional episodes with him in the future, because I think he has a lot to share with us. Episode 4, another one I enjoy. And folks, you're going to see several patterns throughout this. And one of the ones that we did not intend, but somehow it worked out, we seem to have an affinity for a guest named David, because episode 4 brought us another David. This one was David Ilola, who serves as a director of training for the Tennessee Correctional Institute. But one job ain't enough for him, because he is also a master instructor in his role in the U.S. Army Reserve. Folks, I was blown away by David's drive to serve and provide training for a profession that is often overlooked. It is one of the most underappreciated parts of the law enforcement profession. I'm talking about our folks that work in corrections. And you know, the different terminologies used to describe them, because it depends if you work in a jail, if you work in a prison, if you work in a juvenile center. But the fact of the matter is, folks, the people who serve in this capacity are constantly exposed to danger. And yet, despite of that constant exposure, they often aren't given the training that will make them safer and allow them to deliver a better service. But David, he's committed to ensuring that they get this. And folks, I'm not just talking about any training. I'm not talking about training that allows an agency to check the box and say, yep, we did training. No, I'm talking about training that has an impact and influences the future behaviors of those who attend the training. And folks, that's the difference, in my opinion, between training and education. Many organizations provide education, and we need education. I'm not bad-mouthing education, but leaders understand that what we need is training. If your training isn't influencing behavior, then it's not training. And leaders have a responsibility to provide this. To me, one of the most enlightening things that I got from that episode was that if there hadn't have been one of David's previous leaders not allowing him to just sit and coast in his job, if this leader hadn't stepped up and told David, you're not doing your job as a leader, then we might not have David in his current state. But because somebody, a leader, recognized and was able to see the future David, what he was capable of doing, he didn't allow David to settle for less. And I think that is a true essence of a leader. We had several people touch on this, but I think David's example really set it forth, was that leaders develop other leaders. You can't really lead if nobody's following you. The truth is, it's much better if we have an organization of leaders and leaders, effective leaders, develop others. So, David Alola, thank you so much for your contribution and your willingness to be on the podcast. I really enjoyed it. Episode 5 was another one that I really enjoyed. On episode 5, we had the Director of Public Safety and Security for the University of Michigan Healthcare System, Brian Uridge, on as a guest. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, but at least I did. I enjoyed our talk so much that he and I ended up getting together and having lunch together so we can continue the conversation. And again, I wish I'd press record because that would have been that lunch thing would have been another great episode, but I don't learn very well. He is responsible and he's passionate about providing a safe environment in an industry, the healthcare industry, where studies show that 73% of workplace violence occurs. So you think about how much work that entails. If this is the place where most of the violence occurs, but I want to make sure I provide a place of safety, that requires a lot of work. But he pointed out that working to maintain an environment that is actually safe, that's not enough. Because what a leader understands is that those in the environment that you're working in, they must feel that they are safe. And it's even more important when you put it in the context of a healthcare environment, because as Brian put it, that should be a healing environment. And it's very difficult for healing to take place if the people in the environment do not feel safe. They accomplish their mission, his people, his team. They accomplish the mission by being in that environment. Folks, words matter. It's not enough to be there, but not only are they there, but they have meaningful interaction with those who work and visit that environment. And that's what provides that perception of safety. Not only are they actually safe, but there's a perception of safety. Again, as a leader, Brian practices what he expects from his people because he's intentional about having meaningful interaction with his people in their environment. Too many leaders, in my experience, when they want to quote unquote interact with their people, they don't go to where their people are at. They bring their people to where they are. Going to where your people are has much more impact on them. It's important to remember that the quality of interactions between your organization members and those they serve, no matter what your industry is, folks. I don't care if you're in law enforcement, if you're in customer service, if you're in retail, and even nonprofits, folks. The quality of those interactions between the people within the organization and the people they serve, they are a direct reflection of the interactions that leadership has with their team members. If your people need to have better interactions with those they serve, you need to make it a point to have better interactions with your people. You get what you put in, and leaders understand that it's impossible to pour from an empty cup, and they are constantly working to fill the cup of the people that work with them. So, Brian, thank you so much for meeting me not only that day, but also here recently. I appreciate your mentorship, and I look forward to more time where you can help me become the leader that I wish that I had. Episode 6. I like our military folks, and as luck would have it, our next one dealt with a military veteran, retired Marine Corps Colonel Grayson Story was our guest. I find it at least ironic because I wasn't a Marine, that Grayson now works as a team leader for U.S. Army Material Command. He graduated from the Naval Academy, which is, our military academies are known as being a bastion of leadership development. So he graduated from there. He has spent nearly his entire adult life in service of this great country. Grayson, thank you so much for your service. During his time of service, his experience has shown that moral leadership exponentially impacts the team and the leader. And I think we often lose that second part right there. We recognize that leaders have impact on others, but we also impact ourselves. It's one of those things that if I do well as a leader right now, then I'm more likely to do well as a leader in my next opportunity. And so the moral leadership part, I recognize the importance of it, but Grayson really brought it out because he told us that doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason is the essence of being a true leader. And when this is done, moral leadership has more profound impact than even competent leadership does. And folks, our leaders need to be competent. Don't get me wrong. But if you're relying on your competence alone, understand that moral leadership exponentially has more impact. And so leaders must be ethically sound in their dealings with others. If you fail to do that, that is a failure of leadership. And folks, failure to act in a morally and ethically courageous way is one of those mistakes that is very, very difficult for a leader to ever recover from. Be intentional about being that leader that deals with people as they should be dealt with. So Grayson, thank you so much for coming on. Great catching up with you. Episode 7 was a special one because our guest is not only a colleague, but he's also my friend. I would go so far as to say that he's my brother. I love Victor Lauria. He retired as an assistant chief from the Novi Police Department in Michigan, and now he's the criminal justice chair for Madonna University. And what we talked about in that episode was how in his current role, Vic has the opportunity semester after semester to do what leaders should be doing all along. And that's preparing the next generation of leaders to step in. And I was trying to think about how to say this. And I was going to say, for a seamless transition. And to me, seamless isn't enough. I would say an improvement in the transition for the profession. That when that transition is made from one person to another, it's not just seamless, it's a step up. And oftentimes leaders struggle with that right there because we don't want to think that there's somebody out there that can do it better than us. That perhaps the person who is below us in some type of organizational chart is actually more capable, is more competent than us. And folks, there are always going to be people smarter than you, always. What we should strive for more so than competence, not instead of competence, because I told you just a minute ago that leaders need to be competent. What we should be striving for is that my ethics are just as good, if not better, than the person that's coming up next. Not that we're a better person, but because I've been so intentional about my actions that sticks out to people. He shared with us during the episode his realization that in his role, and quite honestly, in any leadership role, that he needed to communicate, provide services in a way that the students needed instead of the way that he preferred, because all of us have preferences in how we do things. And oftentimes we will act like our way is right and their way is wrong. And Vic came to the realization that if he wanted to be truly effective as a leader, to be as effective as he possibly could in that position, that he needed to do it the way the students needed it. Again, this has nothing to do with ethics. It has to do with a leader providing the leadership that is needed in a way that the people needed. I reflected after speaking with him that perhaps the most tragic of all leadership failures is where there is a leadership void that is created when the current leader leaves and there's no one there to take their place, where it's like a rudderless ship because that leader has not done their job, has not done their duty in preparing the next generation of leaders for that organization. So Vic, I love you, brother. Thanks so much for taking time to come and share your wisdom with us. Episode 8 was fantastic, as I believe all of ours are. But episode 8, we had on the Rapid SOS Vice President for Public Safety, Jameson Peavyhouse, as our guest. He's a retired director of a 911 center, and he worked in a profession, folks, that is oftentimes unseen, unappreciated, and undertrained. Those are our 911 dispatchers, our telecommunicators in our public safety agencies. And if you think about it, we often talk about public safety being first responders, but those folks are the first responders. And yet we don't treat them very well in many agencies. Jameson talked about how leading those who may feel, or in some cases are legitimately actually are neglected, how that type of leadership has its own unique challenges. He brought about, and folks, I think he's on to something here. He talked to us about the hiring point in a relationship between an agency and someone who is becoming or wants to become a part of that agency. That is where the agency culture is best protected and strengthened. That if we hire the right people culturally and then train them appropriately, that's how we're going to get the best possible results in our organization. As it is with many things in leadership, if you aren't intentional about your agency culture, you get what you get. Listen, agency culture is something that I have become more and more convinced is the strongest possible antidote for unethical behavior. No matter what your profession, if you have a strong agency culture that is built upon leadership at all levels, that is built upon the need to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, where the expectation is that each and every member of that agency has the best interest of other agency members at heart, your agency, your organization is much less likely to have ethical lapses. We're all going to have ethical lapses, folks, because we are human beings. But in an agency where there is a culture of ethical courage, then those things are anomalies rather than the way of doing business. And so, Jameson, thank you so much for your conversation and sharing your experiences. I still am thinking about that, and that's actually part of what we're going to talk about at the end of the show. But before we get there, let's talk about episode number 9. In episode number 9, we had Rich Carr as our guest. And folks, you're dealing with smart people when you can say Rich is a brain scientist. And he's also the CEO of Carr Knowledge. And to be very blunt with you, he's a deep thinker. He's a thinker about thinking and learning. Man, he has conducted thorough, deep research into the concept of learning. And he's worked hard. He and his colleagues have worked hard. How does true learning happen? What needs to be present for it to happen? And then how do we design it so it's more likely to happen? He's one of those guys that has not only identified a problem, but he also helped find a solution. But then he was kind enough to write it down because he's authored 2 different books. One is called Brain-Centric Design, and the other one is called Surprised. As I mentioned on the episode, they both are part of my library. I have read them both. And in the cases of Brain-Centric, I've read it multiple times. I would propose to you that one of the most effective tools that a leader can use to influence behavior is properly constructed and properly delivered training. In this episode, we just scratched the surface, but Rich in his work has provided us with the roadmap to do just this. Folks, if you don't know how people make decisions, if you don't understand how learning takes place, it is very difficult for you as a leader to have impact, positive impact on the decisions that your people make. I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode if you have not. Check out the show notes. There are links to some resources that can help guide you along that pathway. So, Rich, thanks for being on. It was great catching up with you, and thank you for the work that you do. And then finally, folks, episode 10, the most current episode, we had Chief Dave Ogden on as our guest. He serves as the Chief of Police for Windermere, Florida. This, honestly, folks, was a story that didn't go the way I expected, to be quite honest with you, because he shared with us the path that led him to where he's at, his current position. And once we were done recording and I was reflecting on it, I think it was ironic that most of the conversation actually focused on what he did and what he does away from the job rather than the stuff he did on the job. I've been inspired, honestly, to be a better man, to be a better person because of what he shared with us, because he's a world-class practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He does work in numerous nonprofits on his own time, at his own expense. And I was just floored by how those passions that had nothing really whatsoever to do with his professional position, but they had significant positive impact on the way he did his job in his professional life. He's another one of those guys that also believes that one of the primary responsibilities of a leader is to develop the next generation of leaders. But again, I love people who don't just identify a problem, they actually come up with a solution. He did just that because he implemented a formal mentoring program within his agency that helps to prepare his people. And I think this one right here is important, folks. It helps to prepare his people for what's next in their career, no matter what pathway that looks like, because not everybody wants to get promoted, but they still have the opportunity to be a practitioner and a leader in your organization, and a leader does what needs to be done. And folks, I need to take a quick minute here to reflect and remember a true hero. Chief Ogden had posted this on his LinkedIn today because on the date we're recording this, the chief and his agency and the rest of the law enforcement community are honoring the life of a true hero. Master Deputy Bradley Link was killed in the line of duty on August 3rd, 2024, and during his service to the community of Lake County, Florida. Today is the time set for his memorial service. As we reflect on things, I can think of no greater sign of leadership than someone who makes the ultimate sacrifice in service to others. So I wanted to say, Deputy Link, thank you so much for your service. Rest easy. We have the watch from here. So folks, that's where we've been as a podcast. As I told you towards the beginning that I was hesitant. I was unsure of how the conversations were going to unfold, but that they have been much, much better than I thought. And to be transparent, they have really, really spurred my imagination, piqued my curiosity, if you will, into some parts of leadership that I really hope that in the future we're able to get to. So this is where I ask for your help. I'm going to share some things that I think would be worthwhile topics. And if you find that they're worthwhile as well, I would ask you to help me find some people that really can help us learn together about them. And then after we go through these, if you have some topics that you're like, Mike, man, you're missing out on these over here, please reach out to me. We're going to put my email address in the episode link. Please reach out to me. Say, hey, Mike, I want to talk about these. And if you've got somebody that you feel would be a good guest to talk about those topics, please do an introduction with me. I want to talk to people that know more than me. That means there's a very broad market available for guests on the podcast. But here are some of the ones that I wanted to take a deeper dive in at some point. I am fascinated by the concept of leading up an organization. As we note in some of our classes, there are cases where the people in an organization that are most in need of being led are people that outrank the people that can do the leading. And people who are able to lead up well fascinate me, because that is not an easy task. That is not, going back to David Snively's episode, something that we're comfortable with. But there are people who do it well. And folks, I was fortunate here recently to be doing some work, and I was able to witness someone who was starting the process of leading up. And I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know how that process is going to work out, but I saw this person stepping up and doing their best to try and lead up, and I was blown away. So that's one of the topics. I also want to dig deeper into organizational culture. And there are plenty of case studies out there about agency cultures that were not healthy, and they had tremendous negative impact. But if I could, I want to find some places that have fantastic culture, that this culture has just taken off. And understand, folks, that I'm one of those people that don't believe that a measure of success is how much money we make or how many followers we have on social media or anything like that. Those are just numbers. Sometimes some of the best cultures you will find from a business perspective are in mom and pop shops, where it may be owned by some family members, but everybody that works there feels like they're part of the family. And so I would love to hear from some folks that work in places that are just fantastic places to work. And so if you know of any of those, please reach out to us. Here's something else I wanted to take a different look at. There are often times where leadership will cross, in the vernacular of my profession, jurisdictional lines. And what I mean there, I want to talk to people who have led or have been led by somebody who didn't even work in their organization, that maybe weren't even in the same profession. But leadership, when it's done right, man, it's this force multiplier. And you can have impact beyond where you work, beyond where you live. And so I want to talk to people who have seen that in action, because once you reach that level right there, and again, I'm not saying you're making the national news. You may not even make the local news, but you're making impact in your world. And our world is not limited to the place where we work. So I'd love to hear some stories about that. And then the last thing I want to touch on as we wrap it up here, I would love to hear about grassroots change. Command Presence, our sponsor for this podcast, there's a class called Leading Without Rank. And towards the end of it, folks, one of the most powerful things I think that comes about in it, when you're instructing the class and you acknowledge that, hey, Mike, you know what? I can't change the world. And you know what? In most cases, you're right. You're not going to change the world. But folks, I believe that everybody, if they do this stuff right, has the potential to change their world. It has been, at least through my experience and through my study, that some of the greatest changes that have happened in a community, some of the greatest changes that have come about in a country, have not been initiated by somebody at the top. You know, what we refer to them as grassroots. I want to hear about how change has been experienced in a positive way through a grassroots beginning, if you will. Man, I think back to the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement was not initiated by the government, by the formal authority. That was a grassroots movement, and it grew and it gained momentum through effective leadership, and it fundamentally changed America for the better. So it doesn't have to be at that scale, folks, but if you know someone who has been involved in it, if you've been involved in it, please reach out to us. We would love to talk to you. Folks, here we are, episode 11. And if you're a regular listener, I thank you for your support. And I thank you for joining us today. And folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a chance for me to think back on what we've done, because I think oftentimes we hear good things, we don't reflect on it, and it was a momentary impact on our lives. And that's not what I want this podcast to be about. I want our guests to have long-lasting impact on you. And this was just a way of trying to accomplish that. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on your favorite podcast provider. I ask a personal favor of you. If you enjoy this, and I hope you do, that you subscribe to the podcast on your podcast provider. If you prefer, you can find the podcast on our website at commandpresence.net/podcast. But we did something. and I'm kind of excited about it, and I wanted to share it with you. We have taken this podcast to YouTube, so you can find it. We'll have that link on our webpage. We'd love for you if you followed it on there. If that's the way you prefer to get your content, we're all for it. We're trying to meet you where you need it. So in addition to your favorite podcast provider and on our website, you can now find Faces of Leadership podcast on YouTube. Also, be sure to check us out on LinkedIn. We have a professional page there. We try to put out stuff in addition to what we have on each episode, but do us a favor, follow us on there. It will help us get the word out. And by all means, folks, please help us get the word out about how we want to share the good news of the good work that leaders are doing across society. So as we end each episode, let's end this one with, remember, be the leader you wish you had.